Good afternoon, everybody. Ooh, hello. I'm John Walsh. I'm one of the organizers of this lecture series, and I'm honored and especially delighted to introduce my friend Mariët Westermann and tell you a bit about her quite amazing career. She's been one of the most admired and most widely read specialists in the field of Dutch and Flemish art. She's somebody who's an original thinker and yet knows how to write clearly and engagingly for a general audience. She's written the best book on Jan Steen yet, the most useful general book on Dutch art in print, called A Worldly Art, the Dutch Republic, 1585 to 1718, and the best short book on Rembrandt, called Rembrandt, Art and Ideas. If you teach in this field, you hope that those books never go out of print. She's also had an interest in the methods of our field and the histories of those methods. She's edited books of essays, including the collection called Anthropologies of Art, and was the co-author of Art History and Its Publications in the Electronic Age. She's collaborated on several museum exhibitions. The one I remember the most was the marvelous one on Dutch interior paintings. And she's held the prestigious but horrible job of reviews editor for the Art Bulletin. She was born in the Netherlands, graduated in history from Williams College, got her MA and PhD in art history under Egbert Haverkamp-Begeman, himself a Yale product, and at the Institute, and Begeman, however, at the Institute of Fine Arts, to which he decamped at some point. She went back to Williamstown as Associate Director of Research and Academic Programs at the Clark and Art Institute in Williamstown, and she taught at Rutgers University. In 1907, UCLA called her back, not to teach art history, but to begin the development of their new campus in Abu Dhabi. There she became provost and chief academic officer. Having launched NYU Abu Dhabi, she returned to be director and professor at the Institute of Fine Arts. But there's more. Now for the past 7 years, she's been vice president of the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, where she directs the grant-making portfolio. So that's put her knowledge and her energy at the service of innovative work in many fields, including, I'm glad to say, museums and universities. Somehow, despite her taxing day job, Mariët manages to keep her hand in the game. Right now, she's working on the subject of the Garden of Eden as a theme in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and also on Dutch art of the global 17th century. That's an interest of hers, one that brings us together, her here to speak in this series. She's also good at titles. So hers today is The Lemon's Lure. Mariët Westermann.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, John, for one of those introductions that only your mother would believe if she were here to believe it. It's really very kind. And John has been a great mentor to many of you here, I know, students and colleagues, and certainly has been to me. From the earliest days in the field, even though I neither worked for the Getty nor did he teach at my institution. He's just has that kind of generosity, as you heard. I first was supposed to give this lecture more than a year ago, so I'm so grateful to John and to Jacques and every one of the good colleagues here at the fantastic Yale University Art Gallery for accepting the postponement. I hope that this presentation deferred, maybe pleasure doubled, even though the topic is a little acidic. So, let's go. The first picture that I remember seeing consciously as a painted thing is this still life by Willem Klaas Heda, painted in 1635. My mother had dropped me off at the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam because she needed to attend to my grandmother. I must have been 11 or 12, which is the age that the Dutch let their kids run loose on the town. But I don't remember really where I wandered in that wonderful castle full of pictures. I do recall this painting in particular trapping me and making me realize first that when I came close enough to those glistening light reflections that you see on the edges of the pewter dishes, that they would dissolve into paint when you came close enough. And second, the picture made me realize that the sort of waxy nubs and pits of the lemon's rind and these dry filaments of its pith actually rose up just a bit from the smooth surface of the tablecloth. I remember distinctly looking at this and being astounded by it. And the skill required for making paint look like these other materials seemed unfathomable. How did he do it? At the time, this question had nothing to do with the meaning of the dishes or the lemon, but was a problem of craft matching perception. Years later, as I became a historian of Dutch painting, I saw so many peeled lemons in still life paintings that I initially didn't give their presence another thought. The motif was so common that I only came to see it as strange and demanding of an explanation about 20 years ago, when I heard David Friedberg speak on the natural history of the lemon in 17th century Rome. This was this kind of chance encounter with a lecture that made me rethink this early youth experience. At the time in my career, I was trying to understand how the 17th century Dutch market for paintings made it so easy and imperative for Dutch painters to pick up each other's pictorial innovations, picking up each other's motifs left and right. The lemon, so ever present, could clearly be one such trope. But these market questions I was working on were taking me in other directions, and I let the lemon sit there. Now, as we, as a discipline and as a knowledge community, are increasingly focused on global histories of trade and on the integration of art and science as a key to innovation in our own society, the time has come to explore the convergence between David Friedberg's insights into early modern citrus studies and the rise of the lemon in painting. This talk is about that convergence, seeking to answer why there are so many lemons in Dutch paintings, and especially still life, and how they came to be peeled. Did you ever think about that? Yeah. Did the Dutch market for luxury commodities shape this motif? And what was in it for artists? The talk will proceed in three parts. In the first part, I want to examine and briefly introduce the dynamic of the Dutch market for paintings and how it interacted with the rise of certain motifs and genres. So that's a section on motifs and markets. In the second part, we'll get into the heart and the meat, the fleshy meat of the talk, which is really about the lemon's lure, the appeal, the aesthetic appeal and demands that these lemons make on us and on painters. And the third part will be a very sort of classic, almost arcane technical art historical deep dive into the genealogy of the motif, where I try to establish where it really came from. And we'll see what you think. So, part one, motifs and markets. 17th century Dutch painting is rife with instances of artists recycling their own motifs and others then picking them up. This may be especially true for still life paintings. Still life paintings which often rearranged props a painter owned. Artists like Willem Klaas Heda, whom we've already seen, repeated motifs that interested them and sold well, as in the case of the silver tazza, tipped over on its side, that silver dish, in the still life of 1635 from the Van Otterlo collection that you see on the left. And a version by Willem Klaas Heda himself, painted 2 years later in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, where he just rings a few little changes in a virtually identically sized painting. Willem Klaas Heda may then have passed the tipsy silver dish along to Pieter Klaas, his contemporary in Haarlem. Little younger Pieter Klaas. And before long, you see that dish, right? It's always on its side for some reason. Before long, the tazza on its side was all the rage, showing up in paintings of a wide range of themes and quality. The rapid emergence and widespread circulation of a limited number of such motifs in Dutch painting, it's really a quite limited number, even though there are many, it's still limited, singled out from all the possible worldly objects that you could choose from on the Dutch market. This limited repertoire always struck me as extraordinary for an age without photography, motorized transport, or modern media that would allow you to pick these things up quickly. Clearly, there was a very active exchange among artists who could see each other's things in these kinds of feedback loops. So on the Dutch market in the 17th century, motifs like this popped up and multiplied in pictures by different artists, often across disparate genres, out of still life into portraiture and so forth. I'll give one example. The opened mouth, with an ostentatious rack of teeth. This was not a particularly prevalent motif of European art. It occurs, but it was usually reserved to very boorish people or Christ on the cross occasionally in extreme pain. But all of a sudden, this uncouth element begins to frequent Dutch images in the 1620s. Early on in Hendrik ter Bruggen, as you see here, and about the same time or even a little earlier in Frans Hals's Children. And then by 1630, Rembrandt, who was always on to a quick innovation, he showed it on a beggar, on himself, and on Christ, in images that stand in clear relation to each other. And then just about the same time, Adrian Brouwer made it a perfect figure of boorishness, looking for all the world, like this guy had just swallowed some unsweetened lemonade. These open mouths have, when you see them together like this, they have nothing to do with each other, besides offering a striking bit of expression that must have fascinated viewers, because these pictures sold. A motif like this, I could show you 100 or more of these, could multitask, enabling painters to deploy it quite flexibly and show their capacities as innovators who knew the latest fashions and could work them into new settings and into saleable works. And such positioning was a necessity in the dense urban art market of Holland. This market was larger in the 17th century and certainly less centralized than earlier art markets had been. And it was more diversified in its mechanisms of exchange. How things actually got to market was extremely diversified. Emerging in a prosperous Protestant society, this market was no longer overdetermined by the needs of the Catholic Church or an entitled aristocracy. This market had hardball dealers, protectionist professional societies, and sycophantic studio visitors. It featured price tracking, down-market auctioneering, and wild speculation, as well as tendentious art criticism and shameless self-promotion. We saw Rembrandt just now. It was the first modern art market. Without top-down controls from state or church, it lowered the barriers to entry in a way, but it also made it much harder for artists to monopolize a market segment, as, say, Rubens, a favorite of the Habsburg court, could in the Netherlands to the south. This new urban market nurtured a modern field of painting, against which the silver dish, or the opened mouth, or the lemon could be contoured as open-ended tropes, little pieces you could plug in and use to your ends. This market offers no singular explanations for the invention or resonance of particular motifs. It is too wide open a market. And in a similar way, a certain pliability of interpretation could arise around these motifs. They didn't all mean the same thing to everybody, for obvious reasons. Market feedback loops can tell painters what people want, but they do not determine why people may want it, and often the artists simply don't know. This indeterminacy of these motifs was a boon to ambitious 17th century painters like Rembrandt, who could use a motif like the opened mouth to advance his own agenda for his painting while also getting paid for it and reaping success. Throughout Dutch pictorial production of the 17th century, which is a massive production, unprecedented high production of paintings, more than 1 million over the century for sure, when you see that whole production, you can see market preferences emerge in this modern system of painting, while artists nevertheless strive to maintain a certain inventive autonomy and gain market share. That's what a lot of these motifs are about. Certain artists come to own them. Entire genres and styles were established rapidly in this market system, building on product innovations or process innovations by one or two pioneers that then caught on or made good economic sense. So, for example, as innovations associated with prestigious painters, collectors, or institutions stuck and really took hold, other styles and genres might wax or wane. So, for example, in the 1630s, the famous tonal landscape mode of Jan van Goyen, of which you can see a wonderful example upstairs, virtually wiped out a colorful anecdotal style of landscape of his predecessors. But he got his comeuppance because that style was only to be undone the next generation by a heroic, distinctly colored landscape painting for a different age that we very much associate with Jacob van Ruysdael. You can really see the striking difference between them. So much for these market dynamics. What about the lure of the lemon? In the surge of singular motifs in the 1620s, the lemon was a fast rising star, and it had staying power. Like the opened mouth, it ranged promiscuously across the genres, though still life remained its home. Amazingly, the lemon has not disappeared from Western still life since the Dutch put it there. You will start seeing them everywhere, I promise you. What accounts for the sudden rise of the lemon, and particularly the peeled one, in still life? The ubiquity of the motif suggests that no single explanation can be considered causal for it. We've already gone over that. The market's too complex and large. Our exploration of the factors driving the production and reception of the lemon motif suggests that lemons became objects of pictorial attention because they engaged the entwined interests of Dutch commerce, natural history, and painting. These sectors overlap, and they're sort of overlapping and intertwining in an interesting way. Commerce, natural history, and painting. That's the nexus I'm going to talk about, not to claim that there's one single cause of this, but to sketch kind of an environment in which the peeled lemon could arise. David Friedberg, whom I already mentioned about that citrus lecture, first recognized that in Holland the lemon stood at a significant nexus of botany, horticulture, trade, and art. But he got to that insight via Italy. Friedberg wrote an entire monograph, the only art historian to have done so, on the lemon and its many siblings. A volume called Citrus Fruit in the Paper Museum of Cassiano del Pozzo, published in the early 80s, or late 80s. In the 1980s, while flipping through boxes in the Windsor Castle print room, Friedberg had discovered dozens of drawings of citrus fruits by a man named Vincenzo Leonardi. And he quickly realized that these drawings must have been commissioned by Cassiano del Pozzo, who was a famous early 17th century collector, but also an amateur scientist in Rome. Cassiano was the mastermind of a project that would chart the world of natural wonders, the entire world of natural wonders and antiquities, through large albums of drawings commissioned from all sorts of artists that were then to be published. That was the grand plan. So much for the grand plan. They weren't published until David Friedberg and others got to it in the 20th century, but it was a great plan. Now, one of the parts of this project was dedicated to the citrus family. And the citrus family was absolute grist to the mill of Cassiano and that of his friends in a very special academic society called the Academy of the Lynxes. The lynx is a very sharp-eyed animal, right? The Academy of the Lynxes, which was a distinguished society of scientists whose most famous member was Galileo. So we're talking about Rome in the first decade of the 17th century. At the time, citrus fruits were understood to be related to each other somehow. But before Linnaeus, many years later, that relationship was not considered to exist in shared reproductive mechanisms. Now we know that it's all about how these plants reproduce, that puts them into families, but that wasn't the case at the time that the lynxes were drawing these things. Instead, Leonardo and these academic lynxes believed that if you just drew a lot of individual fruits like this and cut them open that seemed related to each other, some system of resemblance and differentiation would emerge and would lead to an understanding of the entire extent of what was possible if you were a citrus fruit. You could look in any number of ways. Friedberg was fascinated by this, but he concluded that the uncommon quantity, the variety, and the quality of the drawings produced by the Academy of the Lynxes represented a missing link in the history of natural history. It's sort of a seismic, or as sometimes is called, an epistemic, a knowledge shift in natural history that he identifies with this academy and especially these drawing projects. Whereas in the late Middle Ages and in the Renaissance, scholars had still been slotting objects into taxonomies by their external resemblance to other objects that could be from wildly different realms of nature or culture. So, for example, a stone might remind you of the face of an animal or something like that. The lynxes went about it more systematically. They had faith that if they could draw objects that truly looked pretty much alike, and if they could cut them and draw their innards as well as their outsides, their skins of thousands of natural objects in all these related classes, they could encompass the possible forms of the entire natural world and then begin to draw out connections among them. It's as if you would draw all of us and then every other person on the planet and say, oh, now we know what people look like and how they relate to each other. It's in a way sort of a crazy thought, but if you're just dealing with citrus, it may not seem so impossible. Now, sort of enough of that. Friedberg argued that this faith that pictures could produce an organized taxonomy of the natural world all by themselves was doomed to fail. With anomalies like these hybrids that you see here, of which there were many drawings, the practice of drawing lemon after lemon, citron after orange, grapefruit after pomela, etc., only made it harder to arrive at a stable taxonomy. This challenge confirmed that the route to botanic taxonomy would not in the end be by dissection and drawing alone. That wouldn't get you there. And a century and a half later, Linnaeus would indeed effect that monumental change in our conception of the natural world by categorizing the plant kingdom according to reproductive parts and mechanisms. And that system is still with us today and is now, of course, works in a way through DNA and the genome. Okay. What does the pictorial cataloging of citrus fruits in the 17th century in Rome have to do with the appearance of lemons as in still life in the Netherlands, where they appear outside the immediate context of this new natural history? Cassiano's project certainly shows the keen contemporary interest in citrus as an object of visual fascination. They were at these things tirelessly, obviously. The interesting thing to think about there is that citrus fruits are, in a way, not natural. They are cultivated, certainly in this kind of profusion and prodigious quality. They're not found in all their differentiation in the wild. Although they had been known in Europe, having come from Asia, since the Middle Ages, the Renaissance courts of Europe and the new botanical gardens associated with universities went crazy about them, building orangeries to nurture the self-preserving, tasty and healthful fruits through the colder months. In this sense, the lemon was a product of human artifice, just as much as the objects of metalwork, porcelain and glassware on the still life table. Some Dutch paintings, like this one by Willem Kalf, seem to acknowledge this fact and relish the differentiation of citrus fruits among other luxuries. And they highlight the play of light that they could generate here in a silver pitcher. Scientific interest in citrus ran high in Holland, however. Leonardi's drawings had an afterlife in Europe in a delightful manual that was published in 1646 by the gardener Giovanni Battista Ferrari, a Jesuit. And this little manual addressed the cultivation as well as the culinary and medicinal properties of a whole range of citrus fruit. The book was well known in the flourishing Dutch botanical community that was just beginning to organize itself. In 1676, so about 30 years after the publication of the book, Jan Commelin, who was a co-founder of the Amsterdam Botanical Garden, used Ferrari's manual as the basis for his own book, which he called The Dutch Garden of the Hesperides, The Dutch Garden of the Hesperides, referencing the Greek mythological garden of the golden apples, you may have heard about, the garden of the golden apples. And that was, of course, because those golden apples were thought to have been oranges in all likelihood. Now, Commelin's book, this Dutch version of the Ferrari manual, published in 1676, included several illustrations after Leonardi's citrus drawings. Friedberg, always very alert to these interesting connections between science, art, and commerce and publication, discerned new research opportunities in this genealogy, as he wrote in 1991. Long time ago. It took us a long time to pick this up, obviously, but there you are. I want to quote what he wrote because it is really very perceptive and has been very generative for my own work. He wrote, "Oranges in the Netherlands. Here is a subject to conjure with. He talks like that. It is worth reflecting both on the growth of private gardens in the Netherlands and on the role of citrus cultivation and orangeries in them. Citrus fruit in still lifes, lemons above all, may have all manner of symbolic significance, but it is only when we consider books like Commelin's and Ferrari's, with their excellent discussions of the origins and uses of oranges and lemons, their medicinal purposes, their uses as cures, perfumes, pastilles, the basis for sherbets, and so on. Only when we grasp all that, we begin to understand the cultural freight of the presence of citrus fruit in pictures. The more exotic, the better. They become food for the eyes, even when warmed or wilted." So that was the challenge I set aside for a long time and came back to a few years ago as I became interested in the Garden of Eden. Now, Dutch artists certainly advanced the natural historical study of the lemon as well as individual specimens. Here, for example, is Maria Sibylla Merian's wonderful watercolor study of a citron, or etrog, as it's known in Hebrew, made in preparation for her landmark publication on the insects of Suriname, this intrepid woman who traveled to Suriname to study these insects and what they ate. But Friedberg's comment on lemons in Dutch still life identified to me an art historical problem transcending botanical study alone. How did the lemon, and to a lesser extent the orange, become such a topic, such a prevalent motif? Could twinned scientific interest and commercial availability of citrus fruit account for the proliferation of the peeled lemon in still life? How would you make such an argument rather than a loose association? Friedberg's opening made me see lemons everywhere. There didn't seem to be a 17th century banquet piece without them. Well, there are some, but they're not a lot. Heda from the Van Otterlo collection. Klaas. Jan Janszoon den Uyl, a different kind of twist. Jan Davidszoon de Heem, an elegant calligrapher of the peel. Jan van de Velde, kind of a contrarian. He leaves the fruit whole in 1651. Willem Kalf, we already saw, who's also kind of an orange man. And then a literally unending parade of anonymous painters working cheap and cheerful for the most part. How did all this citrus get to the damp and cool north? Well, interestingly, I would take a little issue with Friedberg's characterization of the lemon as the more exotic, the better. Because of all the exotic taste sensations from warmer climates that flooded Dutch markets, citrus fruit may have been more common than most. The botanical gardens of Leiden and Amsterdam had orangeries and limonaias, and private citizens cultivated citrus trees as well. Interestingly, genre paintings track the Dutch domestication of Mediterranean citrus. This little girl in the center here of Jan Steen's St. Nicholas Day, painted in the mid-1660s, counts an orange among her special treasures. You see it there in the little pewter basket, shopping basket. To this day, Dutch children sing of the apples of orange that St. Nick brings from Spain on December 5th. Well, I hope they still sing it. I did, but, you know, it's there's certain changes of habit, but the song is out there. And oranges clearly in the 17th century became regular fare for the well-heeled, at least, and that was a growing middle class. In 1665, Egelon van der Neer painted an elegant young woman offering a bit of orange and lemon, the sweet and the sour, to an unseen companion to the right. She is herself, as you can see, a study in shades of orange of great refinement. You see the orange as well as lemon there. A similar coloristic riff, this time in yellow, structures this picture by Gerard ter Borch from the same period, where a young woman and her sweetheart make lemonade out of lemons. As you can see, at the heart of the composition, in that beautiful transparent glass, Ter Borch played out the yellow theme with great sophistication. Just as the lemon rind swirls around the liquid, materials in yellow and ochre, finely differentiated, sort of dance and revolve around this glass. The compositional thoughtfulness of these painters, I've just shown you, suggests that they painted citrus fruits not just because they were a hot commodity or because they offered a ready pun on the sweet and sour pangs of love. I'm sure they were interested in these things, but there was more to it. There was something in it for artists. The naturally saturated, bright colors of oranges and lemons appear to have become a special painter's challenge and delight. I often think of these Dutch artists in these very kind of dark climate that the Netherlands has, as just being stunned by the sunniness of the south coming to them in these fruits. You have to imagine that in an age before electric light or wide availability of synthetic pigments, the sunny fruits with their shiny rinds and juicy flesh shone a light all of their own. In the cool light of the north or at the darkening end of the day, they glow the way still life painting seems to claim that they do, as Jan van Eyck suggested already 2 centuries earlier in the Arnolfini wedding portrait, of which I show you a tiny detail at the left. With his seemingly accidental, immaculately framed details, Van Eyck, the first great oil painter, gave still life painters to come some of their assignments. Pay attention, people. In his Lucca Madonna, for example, he stretched across the panel contrasts of form, color, transparency, and reflectivity that would become fundamental to still life, very typical of still life challenges. So here, obviously, you have the 2 lemons. Here you have all these objects. And so just imagine her gone for a minute. It's hard, I know, it's hard. She's big. Okay. So these would become sort of fundamental to still life. He balancing the 2 oranges at the left periphery of the pictorial field against glass, brass, and liquid on the right side. And then he set these off against a beige monochrome of great subtlety that unifies his picture as well as any Dutch painter would do 2 centuries hence, as here Pieter Claesz does in a very valiant effort. Still life artists outside Holland also saw citrus as a resource and challenge, however. It's not as if no one outside the Netherlands painted these things. Antwerp painters took up the fruit with relish. Jacob van Hulsdonk in particular, loading up pictures with lemons and oranges and bursting open a lush pomegranate for bloody contrast. Eventually, almost every great painter in the still life tradition would at one point or other take on citrus as an object of study. In fact, in Spain, Juan Sánchez Cotán pioneered the power of lemons before the Dutch even. This is 1602. And in the same country, and in Seville, the fantastic Zurbarán achieved a rare blend of description and mathematical organization for his citrus fruit and other objects. You know all the others too, of course. Chardin, though not as often as I had expected. That was an interesting finding. Cézanne, over and over again. Van Gogh. Gauguin. Picture looks a lot better in real life. And of course, and you will have thought of this, Matisse. This complex still life of 1915 in fact restructures a very faithful copy that Matisse had made 20 years earlier of a picture by Jan Davidzoon de Heem, an actual Dutch painting. This is the picture in the Museum of Modern Art. But as a young man, he went to the Louvre, where this painting on the right is to this day, and made a copy of it. This is the actual painting I'm showing you. But this is what Matisse saw, had copied extremely faithfully in a painting in Montpellier. And then 20 years later, 22 years later actually to be precise, he goes on and makes this. But in modernist fashion, Matisse's later painting edits out de Heem's ostentatiously curled lemon peel, twisting off the body of the revealed fruit. You see it here. See how sophisticated you think of him as one of the sort of calligraphers of, there's a little bit more lemon on the right. But Matisse, just to give you the whole picture again, there's the detail of Matisse's picture, and here is what happens to that curly lemon. Now, it is still there in the Matisse, but if I hadn't told you, you might have thought de Heem's winding peel had become the rind of a melon or the rim of a bowl. It's really a full reconsideration that has something to do about the waning of the lemon peel, in fact, over time, even though the lemon itself stays central to still life. Now, of the citrus family, the lemon appears to have had the greatest appeal to still life painters through the centuries after Sanchez Cotán. Perhaps because its high-keyed color was challenging to integrate into one's composition without letting it dominate everything else, or because that color stood out spectacularly, as you've already seen, against the darkest hues. But most great Western painters did not pursue the signature invention of Dutch still life, the artfully dangling, twisting and curling, unbroken peel. It's as if the Dutch exhausted the benefits of the possibility. They exhausted the possibilities that were very real. And as these virtuoso specimens by Kalf and Heda show you, the motif really had much to offer when it was first invented. The rind and the white pith together showed lemon yellow's closeness to, yet distinction from, white. Against green, red, and blue, the yellow and white leapt out, as Matisse saw so clearly. As a complex, irregular spiral, the peel could generate a subtle sense of depth if the painter could only solve a very difficult problem of perspectival coherence, which was often identified and talked about, in fact, around spirals. The spiral is hard to represent in 3 dimensions on a flat surface. And once opened up, the lemon offered yet more surface for the painter to paint, to create what is almost a miniature still life within a still life, offering contrast of capricious curl and near circular section, knobby opaqueness outside, glassy translucency within, highest lights and deep shadows, as you see in these examples, to manifest movement and depth. Those qualities of the lemon could then be contrasted with minute painterly nuance to the objects nearby, ever shinier, like glass, ever more transparent, like more glass, ever nubbier and waxier, and so on and so forth. In this detail of a still life by Danel, we are, in fact, a kind of a claim is made on our attention, and we are hard-pressed to discern the distinction between the lemon rind and the bread roll, painted differently, but with near identical pigment and very near each other. Here's the bread roll, here is that lemon, and here is that tablecloth around it. So you're asked really to concentrate on these fine distinctions. It is a great bit of virtuosity that really calls out to you against all these other objects. The last part of my talk is about the genesis of this motif. Where did painters get this idea, this brilliant idea, of stripping the lemon but leaving the peel on? Cutting open fruit in still life clearly must be related in some way to the contemporaneous researches of the naturalists who drew the citrus inside out in Rome to the knowledge of the North as well. Cassiano's research artists dissected lemons and oranges in all sorts of ways to enable academicians to study their innards, count their seeds, and narrate their digitations, pregnancies, and other marvels. Dutch lemon peel painters registered this shift toward the interior study of life forms. That is a real movement of the 17th century and 18th century. But students of citrus never, as far as I know, show them peeled in the manner of Dutch painters. That wasn't interesting to them. They were interested in these innards. I believe the origin narrative of the peeled still life lemon goes something like this. Painters of the Madonna, particularly in the north, had long included citrus fruits cut open, as here, especially varieties that were then referred to as Adam's apple. Here you see it, and here's a little part for the baby. As Adam's apple, they were often called Adam's apple, in reference to the redemptive interventions of Mary and Christ that are talked about in a way in these pictures. But these citrus sections are ciphers rather than diligent studies of the kind we just saw. When citrus, meanwhile, became a staple of the middle-class table, painters like Nicolaas Gillis, who was born in Antwerp but painted mostly in Haarlem, cut citrus the same way as these Madonna painters and indeed as the Lynxian academics. And interestingly, they often include a knife right there for ease. Surely artistic interest in the interior fruit was supported by the practice of botanical drawing in Prague, Rome, and the Netherlands. Prague is interesting in this regard. This is where this sheet comes from a place that John Walsh knows very well. Joris Hoefnagel's study of a sour orange on this calligraphic page with some calligraphy by a master calligrapher, another calligrapher. This study was made at the Habsburg court of Prague and was the product of a culture there of science and self-conscious artistic virtuosity. Science and art were fully integrated in the person of this artist, Joris Hoefnagel. But he made sort of more of these manuscript studies. He did not make still life paintings. It is as if in still life painting later, the flourishes of the wonderful dangles and flourishes of the calligrapher here and Hoefnagel's naturalist observation somehow come together in the lemon's trailing, twisting peel. I cannot prove this in any way, but I think the visual connection is certainly interesting. But back to the story, the invention of the motif was truly a painterly affair, more than a botanical one. Peeling a lemon in this particular way that we've seen is not intuitive at all. I have tried it, and it is not easy. Keeping the peel whole and making sure that it doesn't pull the fruit off the table or out of a bowl is a feat of dexterity. And an aware viewer at the time might equate that accomplishment with the painter's manual skill. The painter put it there for us in multiple ways. Now, the idea to represent the product of this counterintuitive action in paint may have been prompted by a domestic pleasure that survives in the Netherlands and I think elsewhere to this day, that of keeping an apple peel whole by moving a knife around the fruit in unbroken movement. Have you tried this? You may have done it with your potatoes. You can also do it with an apple. It's still a real skill. And here you see it. Floris van Dijk appears to have introduced the peeled apple in still life. He really seems responsible for it in the early 16th teens in Haarlem, the same town I already mentioned. And he lets it dangle off the table into our space, just as plates or knives might jut out of us in still life painting to create a sense of extension into our space. In these pictures, the paring knife is always at hand to remind you of that action of the painter. Again, there's a lot in this for painters. Now, Van Dijk, this picture is in an unknown location, so it's a terrible sort of wiki grab. But you can see that this is a very similar painting to the one we just saw. They ring the changes on themselves. They kind of figure out a good formula. They keep putting it in that market. But here you see that same a similar sort of apple peel from a few years later. And at this point, he had begun to associate the apple peel with lemon sections. Someone must have put two and two together, right? At some point, or one and one. But he stopped short of ever peeling a lemon, as far as I know. Enter Peter Klaas. We've already seen some of his pictures. Peter Klaas, who moved from Antwerp to Van Dijk's Haarlem around 1621, may have been the first to transpose the apple peel conceit onto the lemon. From 1621 to 1629, his paintings virtually track the process of invention, almost year to year. First, here there is the orange, with the knife waiting, inviting us to imagine it sectioned. And sure enough, the painter soon obliged, leaving the knife still to the side. Then, in 1625, he peeled the entire rind of one specimen and left only 2 slices of the fruit to which it had belonged. Here is the rind. And there are the 2 slices, and there's a whole lemon to the side. The dish protruding beyond the table edge stridently reflects that second whole lemon. Over the next couple of years, Klaas varied these motifs in increasingly refined pictures, like this very complex still life of 1627. And you see, it's just a joy to see how different they all are. Ostentatious, finely sliced, a couple of sections, and so forth. He really is having fun with this, you think. By then, by 1627, he sometimes curled the peel itself over the edge of the table. This may be the first occasion. But then, really wanting to, again, to be an effective player in the market for different audiences, not everyone wants ostentation, especially not in the Protestant Netherlands. So by 1629, before the decade was over, he had learned to mute the coloristic spectacle into monochrome subtleties in smaller pictures, the better to let the lemons and their sinuous peels speak for themselves. Over the arc of his career, Klaas mastered a full repertoire of the motif and never seems to have tired of it, effortlessly integrating compositional, coloristic, and textural skills. Although Klaas then is probably the hero of my story, and almost certainly made the most deliberate contributions to the establishment of the lemon peel as the quintessential mark of still life, he appears to have developed the device in collaborative rivalry with his peers, including colleagues in his native Antwerp. Ultimately, I think, pinpointing a single originator for any popular motif on the early modern market of the Dutch Republic, even for this lemon where I'm pretty sure, is not especially meaningful or fruitful. It's not really the point. In this thriving urban economy, fashions arose through feedback loops among artists, buyers, and intermediaries, such as publishers and dealers, and probably botanists and horticulturalists. The rise of memes from the still life banquet itself to the tatsa to the lemon, was an emergent phenomenon. It emerges in complex relations. Rather than a top-down effect driven by singular artists or customers, the way Rubens will have had an extremely dominant effect on what was produced in the southern Netherlands and elsewhere in Europe. Even if some painters like Klaas were nimbler in establishing or owning singular contributions than others. The interactive dynamic in the development of motifs can be discerned in the evolution of the lemon peel after Klaas's early interventions. Initially, Willem Klaas Heda seems to have followed the lead of Peter Klaas, his younger peer, thrusting the peel forward just a little in the first instance of his lemon paintings. But by 1635, Heda had developed a truly monumental mode of still life, in which long, dangling peels play critical balancing or pivoting parts in complex compositions. This is a very large painting, the first one I showed you, that stunned me all those years ago. These great moves appear to have stimulated Peter Klaas to push his later lemons a little farther over the edge. As in this still life with tatsa from 1636. The presence here of the tatsa, remember, a motif associated with Heda, may indicate the reversal of transmission at this point from Heda to Klaas in terms of the generativity of the motif. And we have some evidence that contemporaries thought of them as joined at the hip in this way. As early as 1628, Samuel Ampsing, who was a town historian of Haarlem where all this happened, recognized the novel production of still life by the two painters as a joint endeavor, noting that he could not leave Pieter Klaas unmentioned, and likewise should speak of Heda and his banquets. Between 1628 and 1633, when the Heem, Heda, and Den Uyl suddenly picked up on Klaas's studies, the curling lemon rind became an indelible trope, remaining viable for at least a century, even though artists hardly ever twisted the peels in precisely the same way, and even though they did so less and less after Chardin. A culture of botanical connoisseurship probably fostered inquiry into the distinguishing characteristics of citrus fruits even for painters, but for these painters the interest was primarily an aesthetic and commercial imperative. Like the products of the new natural history, and like the treasures of global trade, pictorial innovations proliferated and morphed in a society that valued connoisseurship and craved novelty and new knowledge, through urban markets that were overflowing with prestigious curiosities and works of art. Moving in endless variation across still life and into genre and even into history painting, the lemon peel became an animating force in Dutch pictorial culture. And as a signature and warranty of Dutch still life, the gold standard of still life perhaps, the lemon peel ensured citrus its storied afterlife in the history of the genre, even as its ostentatious twist in and out of depth lost its appeal for the moderns. Thank you. I welcome your questions and comments. And there's a mic, I see.
Why the lemon, not an orange?
That's an extremely good question. The question is why a lemon and not an orange? And of course, oranges do appear, but they don't peel them in the same way. And I've also tried to peel oranges. They are even harder to balance. They're probably, as a shape, a little bit more the lemon is a bit more versatile. It's not round. But I think it probably primarily has something to do with the, other than the shape, it has something to do with cost. Lemons were cheaper than oranges, so they're more around. They were used in more ways, in cooking, in drinks, as we saw, as a little, they put them into white wine, which seems completely crazy to me, but they did do that. So it's probably about availability. And I think the unusualness of the shape. I am very interested in the idea of the difficult spiral, and so the shape itself is sort of an unusual and difficult shape. Obviously, Jan van Eyck loved their roundness, their unitary sort of quality, whereas I think these painters just were very taken by the shape. It's also true that when you think about the color that at full saturation comes the closest to white, it would be yellow. So there is that heightened challenge also, that I think the heightened contrast that is being played out. Those are pure speculations. Nobody wrote this down anywhere.
I'd like to ask about the paint. I heard somebody talking last night about the Turner at the Frick, and they said that about this point, lemon yellow and orange became available to painters. Could this have played into it?
I think as early as Sanchez Cotan and Pieter Klaas, I am not quite sure, but I might be delighted to look into that. But these pigments are pretty much produced by the painters in their shops, I would say.
Mariët, that was just wonderful, and I enjoyed it so much. In the 16th century, there is quite a bit of legal drama in Mexico about the reclaimed land around Mexico City that should belong to indigenous peoples, but the Spaniards are claiming in order to grow lemons. and they are finding that they are having fantastic productivity of lemons. We never see the lemons in New World painting it's going to be into the 18th century, but I just wondered if you could, where are the lemons all coming from? Who's growing them? Are they growing in Spain? And are they possibly bringing them back in ships because they are so hardy for shipment?
Mary, I love that question, and I hadn't heard that story. So the first thing I would say is that certainly the Dutch would have had no more consideration for the indigenous people of
Sure.
the places they
Sure,
went.
I
I'm sorry
get
to
that.
say, than the Mexican invaders did. But that said, by this time, the lemon and to some extent the orange is really quite prevalent. I'm sure there was some importation, but by now, not only did the botanical gardens, Leiden initially, a little bit later Amsterdam, but also private citizens had orangeries, and they grew and limonayas. They grew lemon trees and orange trees, so they were available certainly to this kind of well-heeled group. And if you're a painter, you certainly would have access to these things as sort of a prop that you picked up and tried to make go as long as you could. So I don't think that's where I take a little issue with David Friedberg's thought that these were truly very exotic. There are just too many of them still to feel completely exotic in this way. Now, the old Dutch song does talk about the apples of orange from Spain, so I always used to think they came from Spain, and of course there's still a lot of importation. But to have enough to paint, I think it was mostly local production.
Thank you.
Lou, why do you assume that the artist had to be able to create the peel like here so perfectly? They have so much talent in there, they could have painted that peel out of their head.
Yeah, that's always a very interesting debate. And who is to say? They certainly make the painting makes the claim that it's not from the head, right? And makes the claim, the extreme veracity claims of this kind of still life are all about making you believe that it hews to this aesthetic of naar het leven, or from the life, which is just this endlessly repeated trope in its own right. I do think that, yeah, my own feeling is that it's worthwhile to arrange these things and try to paint them. Do I think that some people copied after others and then learned to do it themselves, the way you can learn to do a body? I don't disagree with you. But I think the claim is one to truth and posing.
Mariët, question about the peel's appeal, having talked about the lemon's lure. Maybe it's because
it's so fun with this topic, you know, you can go on and on.
It must be because I married a Lutheran pastor's daughter, but I have to ask, when I see that, after all, rather serpentine peel, my first thought is it's an allusion to the serpent in Eden.
To what? To the...
To the serpent in Eden. You've alluded to
Right.
the Garden of Eden. And is there any element of sort of saying this is all vanity, like so many still lives? And is there an implicit allusion to the serpent in Eden in those peels?
I'm going to have to ponder the original sin to answer that question. I obviously, you know, I've been working on the Garden of Eden, Max, for a long time, and I have a certain resistance to the vanitas interpretation of this kind of a still life. That lemon is just sort of there for me. The salt and the sour, the acidic, you know, there is some of all of that, the tipping over of the tatze. But when you see these things so endlessly repeated in these quite expensive works, you begin to wonder why people would buy such expensive sermons for themselves and not just run to church and go listen to them as they could, you know, morning, noon, and night in the Netherlands. So I would probably resist this one. Yeah. But I'll think about it.
So my question really has to do with the period that produced these incredible paintings. And really it seems to me it's not so much an issue of vanity as sheer good taste in all senses. And we're eating within the painting. I couldn't help but notice when the apple was shown, the apple had clearly been eaten. The peel was the residue. And then there was a half-sliced apple just to make the point even clearer. And I can't help but feel that the painting that so inspired you as a child is bedecked with a fish. And this is a period that is discovering new flavors and new combinations. And I suspect it's actually the origin of the term good taste in all things, which is kind of a bourgeois, if I'm not mistaken, Dutch notion.
Well,
Anyway,
the
that's-
Dutch do a lot of things in bad taste, but I can show you. But that said, I love your point. Sorry, did you complete? You completed. I thought it was. I think that's a wonderful point because the sensory address of these paintings is very acute, obviously. Now, this painting makes for a good meal. A lot of the paintings that have lemon at the heart of them, the lemon is sort of is often almost the only thing in it to eat, in fact, or drink if you wanted to. So there is definitely a sense of these pictures also being, let's just give an example here. Now there's a lot of food, of course, and there's interesting new tastes and old tastes and recombination of tastes. And the taste is also in the compositional balancing act, these contrasts of upright and diagonal, or upright and down, round and squared off, transparent, translucent, and opaque, high key, low key color. These contrasts get worked out and are indeed in very good taste. I think there is a sense of a luxury product being created out of the combination of products that are luxury products, but also sometimes very common ones, as we saw, piece of bread.
Hi, Mariët. Thank you so much for that fantastic talk, which was both historical and formal and brilliant in both regards. But I just couldn't help thinking of something my mother said very often about 1945 and the first oranges and the first bananas to come into Britain after 6 years of naval blockade, and the amazing taste of the South when you've been stuck in the North on your own and isolated. And I take your point about lemons being available from orangeries, and I think there are probably orangeries in England too, but most people didn't get to didn't get to enjoy the fruits of them. But don't you think that in your global art history, actually, this is about North and South? That the yellow and the brilliance and the taste and the sunshine is a signifier of something which is not outside the door and is not outside the window, and this is a kind of emblematic globalization within the composition.
Yeah, Tim, I think that's a very good way to put it, and it's obviously not something I emphasized in this particular conversation, but right. I think that's true. But I think that speaks to that multivalency of these motifs. I believe that many people buying these things, I obviously was talking about the painters for the most part here, but many people buying these things would have yearned for that kind of brightness and that sunniness and that sense of taste that we just heard about and flavor associated with the South, warmer places, things many artists even only ever heard about or read about. And so there is a sense of value in that is about that globalized exchange that now makes these things available. I would still insist on there being something else in it for the artists as well that has to do purely with that formal quality of this sort of stunning thing, natural thing that looks almost like, that is also an artificial thing.
Yeah, thank you.
I see a couple of...
in terms of the economy of the region?
Yeah, the question really followed up on Tim's question about the North-South, the relationship to globalized trade. Absolutely. I think these are ciphers of prosperity, just as many of the Venetian glass, there's Venetian glass right there. Many of these still lifes have, what's so interesting about them is they have things from all over the world in them. You see pepper in a lot of them. Pepper was and salt as expensive as anything else in those days. Absolutely the lemons and oranges form part of that. I think that undoubtedly oranges and lemons did arrive. People did have a sense of their medicinal property, the fact that they didn't know it was vitamin C, but that there was a therapeutic quality and preventive quality for scurvy there. I think all these things were known and are, again, something that if you had been a ship's captain bereft of oranges for, 6 months, that would be what you take away. And other people might take that global point more generally, I would think.
Almost squeezed this lemon.
Yeah. No one's asked about margaritas yet.
Thank you for a wonderful, wonderful lecture. My last question is this presence of lemon in Dutch still life unique to just Dutch still life painting? And did you examine, is there also lemon as popular in other European countries still life?
Sure, I'd be happy to say a few words about that question. So, and I went a little fast in some of these parts, I think, but lemons show up already before still life. They show up in the religious paintings that I showed a few of. And I think one of the earliest still lifes that has lemons in it or oranges are in Spain, in fact, where, of course, a lot of these things grew. There are also some in Italy. But what really happens that you do, and then you see them all the way through history to this very day. One of the most wonderful paintings by Chris O'Feely, the contemporary painter who lives in London and Trinidad and Tobago, is called Lime Bar, and it has a beautiful sort of lime still life in it. It really is, Kerry James Marshall, it is a really, really, the lemon becomes incredibly important. But I would say that there is no still life tradition before the Dutch in around 1620 really put it so central that you almost couldn't have, in market terms, you almost could not have a legitimate still life without one of these fruits in it, if it was a banquet kind of still life or a drinking kind of still life. And that's the real change. The second change, and this is the twisting of the peel. That is not something we see before Dutch painting, and I think not before this artist Peter Klaas, whom I mentioned. Doesn't really matter. And that gets picked up, and the French copy it a lot, and some English, and some, you see it, but it kind of disappears in the course of the 18th century for the most part. So that seems a really special quality. But because, my argument is that because that still life becomes the absolute good housekeeping seal of approval of banquet still life, that has something to do with all these still life painters years and centuries later in all these different countries engaging with it, even if they don't know that that's where that comes from. Does that explain it a bit?